But something was off. When I got back to the front, just a few minutes ago, the rest stop was filled with people, but now it was completely deserted. No one was entering or leaving, and the tables where people had lingered were empty. When I received the news of my father's death, I still couldn't fully grasp what I felt. We hadn't seen each other for years. My memories of him were like they were lost in the foggy streets of the small town where I spent my childhood. But now, I had to return to that town for inheritance matters. The thought made me uneasy. The house that awaited me, the past soaked into its walls, and the long-standing silence between my father and me. All of it circled in my mind as the journey went on. It was night, and I was on a long bus ride. As the bus moved along narrow, dark roads, I gazed out of the window. Everything disappeared into the darkness. My eyes were getting heavy when the bus suddenly stopped at a large rest area. The announcement echoed, "Break. 20 minutes." I stepped off the bus to stretch my legs and clear my head. The lights of the rest stop were shining, with a few old vehicles parked around. Everything was silent. After a while, I realized I needed to use the bathroom. Following the signs inside the rest stop, I found the restroom. As I finished and stepped out, my eyes froze for a moment. At the end of the hallway stood a man. But this wasn't just any man. He looked exactly like my father, the one I hadn't seen in years, the one whose memory still haunted me. I was paralyzed. My heart pounded in my chest, and for a moment, I thought it was all a hallucination. Perhaps the fatigue of the journey and the thoughts of my father were playing tricks on me. But the man started walking without hesitation. I blinked, feeling the unease growing inside me. "Dad?" I called out, my voice barely a whisper. He didn't answer, just kept walking. I began to follow him. The man walked toward the back of the rest stop. I quickened my pace, trying to catch up. He turned a corner, and I rushed right after him. But when I got there, no one was there. I looked around in confusion. The vast area behind the rest stop was eerily empty. There was no sound, no sign of anyone, just darkness and silence. A chill ran down my spine. The place was so deserted, so cold. There was no trace of where my father or the man who looked like him had gone. I took a deep breath and decided to head back to the bus. As I walked toward the front of the rest stop, the only sound I could hear was the crunching of small stones under my feet. But something was off. When I got back to the front, my heart almost leaped out of my chest. Just a few minutes ago, the rest stop was filled with people, but now it was completely deserted. It was as if I was in a dream. No one was entering or leaving, and the tables where people had lingered were empty. Everything looked abandoned. I wanted to take another step, but my body pulled back, the uneasiness inside me growing. My mind was racing with thoughts. How could this happen so quickly? How had the once crowded place become so deserted in an instant? I thought of the bus. I immediately ran in that direction. When I reached the spot where the bus was parked, I couldn't believe my eyes. The bus was still there, as were the other cars, but no one was inside. It was completely empty, as if it had been abandoned. The fear inside me slowly began to grow. The rest stop was deserted, and everything had changed so suddenly. The air was so cold that I realized I was starting to shiver. There was no point in staying outside any longer, so I decided to head back inside the rest stop. There might not be anyone inside, but at least I'd be sheltered from the bitter cold outside. I needed to calm down, so I headed toward the vending machines. I grabbed a few snacks and a drink and sat at the nearest table. I had just started to process what had happened when suddenly, all the lights went out. At that moment, a shiver ran down my spine, and the darkness enveloped everything. It must have been just a power outage. Maybe there was an issue with the wiring. There was no need to panic. For a moment, I closed my eyes, took a deep breath, and tried to collect myself. Eventually, I decided to check out the rest of the place and figure out what was going on. I headed toward the basement to look for the utility room. As I descended the stairs, I noticed that the metal door at the bottom was slightly ajar. I approached the door and gently pushed it open. The hinges creaked as it swung open, and I glanced inside. The room was dimly lit by a faint light. A single bulb hung from the ceiling, barely flickering. The light was unsteady, as if it could go out at any moment. One question filled my mind. If the power's out, how is this light still on? With this thought swirling in my head, I took a few more steps inside. My eyes scanned the room, and then I froze. Standing there was that man, the one who looked exactly like my father. He stood there with his back to me, completely still. My throat tightened, and fear gripped me. My feet felt like they were glued to the floor. Summoning all the courage I had, I asked in a shaky voice, "Hey, who are you?" The room was enveloped in silence, as if time itself had stopped. Then suddenly, a heavy, cold voice echoed.
"Where were you all these years? Now you remember?"
I froze. I realized my whole body was trembling. My feet felt as though they were glued to the floor, and I couldn't move. At that moment, the man slowly turned toward me. His eyes, they were completely white. His face was shrouded in darkness. For a moment, I couldn't breathe. What was this thing? Before I could comprehend what was happening, suddenly, when I opened my eyes, I was lying on the cold concrete floor. My head was throbbing, and I had no idea how long I had been unconscious. I felt a hand touch my shoulder, and I struggled to open my eyes. Someone was leaning over me. It was a staff member. His face was filled with concern. He asked, "Are you all right? What are you doing here?" My lips were dry, and I couldn't utter a single word. I was still in shock from what I had seen. That man, his face, his eyes, was any of it real? I tried to regain my composure. Slowly, I stood up, unable to even respond to the man. My legs were trembling, but I managed to start walking. As I climbed the stairs, my head spun, and my thoughts were a tangled mess. When I reached the top, everything was normal again. People were moving about the rest stop. The lights were on. For a moment, I stood still, looking around. What had just happened? How could everything return to normal so quickly? I lifted my arm and looked at my watch. I couldn't believe my eyes. Only 4 minutes had passed. Thoughts raced through my mind. Was it a dream? I muttered to myself, but then I paused again. If it was a dream, how did I get to the utility room? I was certain I had heard my own footsteps echoing. I had been there. Everything felt far too real. I began walking toward the bus, my mind swirling with 1,000 questions. Silently, I sat down in my seat. The journey resumed, and as the bus moved forward, my eyes kept fluttering shut and opening again. My head was nodding forward, but I couldn't quite fall asleep. My thoughts kept racing through my mind. Suddenly, my eyes shot open. A chill ran down my spine. The bus was moving through the darkness, but no one was there.